and we'll keep you all on mute as much as possible, and screens off as well if we can until we're sort of speaking there. So thanks very much to the Farming Forum for hosting Arable Scotland today. All these virtual platforms are all very new to us, and I think the Farming Forum's made it really, really easy for us to get some traction and to get a lot of the knowledge out there. We're on Twitter, so you'll have seen us. Sheila's there on HDB Scot, and the hashtag is Arable Scotland. So as I say, things are being recorded so they can be replayed later on. Basis and Enroso points are available. I think there's 6 points available. Obviously, the basis has changed. So if you go onto the website, the basis website, and log in with your number, you can put down these sessions, and that should be able to claim the points on that. And also, if you want to log in on the Arable Scotland website, I think you can get extra points as well through that if you register there. So just Arable Scotland website as well. Okay, so today's this evening's session, we've got David Udall, head of HDB market specialists, and Julian Bell, senior rural consultant for SRUC, and Alison Milne, and Danny Milne's actually beside him. So they are our past monitor farmers, and Danny obviously has a farm there, and Alison is a director of Scotland Food and Drink, and they have their new business, Crafty Maltsters, malting barley in Auchtermuchty in Scotland. So we've got quite a good panel here, and I'm obviously your host as well. So we shall just have a quick run through. So David, we'll just let you introduce yourself and what it is you specialise in for everybody.
Cool. Cheers, Chris. Good evening, everyone. As Chris said, I'm David Udall. I'm head of arable market specialists for AHDB. So my team of 8 or 9 analysts are looking at the domestic and global picture for wheat, barley, oilseed rape, and potatoes as well. And we're trying to provide a view on what we think the prices are going to do next, what the key drivers of the market are. I guess from my personal point of view, I'm kind of always interested in that longer term planning and longer term business strategy and sort of risk management around prices. And I know we're on the cusp of 2020 harvest, but considering we're going to be moving into a new trade agreement with the EU at the end of this year and into 2021, and different trade deals around the world, we're also going to be losing direct payments as well over the coming years. So I think there's a greater need for longer term business planning and taking into account those changes to direct payments and subsidies and what it means for your cropping decisions that you're going to be putting in the ground in a few months' time.
Oh, perfect. Thank you, David. Yeah, very, very interesting, volatile market at the minute as well, isn't it? It's quite a crucial time for all of us, judging by the polls today on the Farming Forum. Julian, if we move over to yourself, do you want to do a brief introduction? Pop yourself off mute.
Good evening, everyone. Julian Bell here. So I run the Rural Business Unit at SEC Consulting, and I cover a range of business issues, and one of them is looking at the grain market, and particularly in Scotland. So, so my interest here today, or focus, what I've been here to discuss, is how some of the wider issues that perhaps David and others are bringing up might be affecting the market here in Scotland. And of course, we've got a few other things in the mix which I've been looking at over the last year or two, is things like Brexit. And of course, we've got a few more unknowns in the mix, including the COVID constraints and things that we all face. So, yeah, and I'm really interested because we can't really be able to get out and about like we normally can. So it's interesting to hear what people are saying about the crops, because I think certainly, there are some of the markets that will be important in terms of what happens here in Scotland, and obviously malting barley. What can we actually grow and deliver this year? That will have, really quite a material effect on the price. So it's interesting to see people's thoughts and views coming forward from the forum.
Fantastic. Okay, and Danny and Alison, are you guys there now? You're Alison, you pop yourself off mute. Maybe. Maybe not. Alison, can you hear us?
Julian, it looks like we've scared them off. I don't know what they said.
Yeah.
I think it was the Proclaimers at the start, wasn't it? That's too much like home. Alison, we're struggling to get you off mute if you can hear us there. So one of the things, guys, that we are looking to discuss. So obviously there's strategies on farm, and that, this year it's kind of gone out the window, hasn't it? I mean, probably one of the wettest back ends we've had for a long time, and now there's a definite uncertainty as to how much we're going to harvest. So, as we've been discussing earlier, you could have thought you were about 50% sold, but if harvest goes against you, you could actually find yourself being 80% sold. So I think there is definitely a little spike in the market, and coupled with the currency, that does seem to have influenced quite a bit of change. So what's the tips for harvest? Should we be looking at fixing a little bit more in now, or do you think we should wait longer?
Do you want to go first, Julian, or do you want me to take up the baton on that one?
You go, David. That's fine.
Amazing. I think it kind of all depends on, as you were kind of mentioning there, Chris. Your starting point, and realistically, a kind of key thing probably is around your budgeting and cash flow for the next sort of 12 months or so, or this season. So if you're thinking, okay, we're going to get a smaller crop. You're uncertain about yields. Like you say, the potential volume that you've got to trade could be down 20%, and therefore, if you've already sold, a decent amount of your harvest movement, and then say, October, November movement, second half of the season, your cash flow could start drying up. So I think that's probably a key factor to look at in terms of, thinking, all right, if I've sold 40% of my grain and suddenly it turns into 60%, at what point is it the right point for your business to be looking at when that other 40% needs to move to actually start to generate cash into your business? Because we know cash flows are going to be tight. So realistically, given the way that the whole UK situation is, we as I think Julian mentioned earlier when we were catching up about this, we're going to be trading at import parity. We've got a weak sterling that will inherently support the value of prices. So that does give us some insulation against kind of the global market effects. Then it comes down to your own business situation and thinking, when do you need to sell for your cash flow, and what does that mean?
Yeah, exactly. So your cost of production becomes absolutely business critical this season. Yep. You've got to know your stuff, I suppose, and then the yield is a bit of the unknown. But cost of production key, and cash flow monitoring is going to be a necessity. And Julian, how do you see that in the local markets? What do you think's around the corner?
Well, I think just continue a wee bit with the different. So you might, if you look at your different crops, obviously malting barley, most contracts are something like 50% you were going to price up before harvest, and you're obviously left to kind of see what happens at harvest. And then you've got wheat. So I think, and you've got rapeseed, and in terms of cash flow, you've got like you've got your single payment.
Julian, just on that, I mean, how big a risk is this? I mean, we were saying there, you've got 50% up front, 170 quid a tonne, whatever it is, and then you've got 50% TBA. I mean, that's 50%. If you haven't sold 100%, you're actually not very well sold at all. And is that not a big risk? I mean, what's the options there? What can you do?
Yeah, I mean, you can't. You're limited, obviously, with malting barley. We have talked in the past about, well, could you sell forward the feed barley to protect your base, and then you could sort of unwind that, obviously, when you send it into malting. But that's not proved very easy, because feed barley doesn't trade particularly. It's not very liquid, and it's not that easy to sell feed barley forward. And we've looked over the years. We've looked at so many different strategies of marketing. The one that most people can manage is simple to follow, and it's never that. It's hard to beat it as a sort of fail-safe as the 50-50, isn't it? So, and that's obviously where the malting contracts have come down. Price 50% before harvest and 50% you've got very little control, to be fair, of that other 50%, unless you take some other mechanism out. But it is a big step forward from where we were before, where it was all priced at harvest. So, and there are upsides and downsides. So, I was trying to think for the different years. I mean, in some ways, this year looks a bit like 2018 in terms of our own weather and things like that. But it'd be interesting to hear what people think. And then we did get a reasonable premium, at least for malting barley prices were pretty good in 2018, weren't they? So I'm not saying that's necessarily going to happen, but we've got potential for the distilling premium. If we don't really deliver on the yields and things here, there is some potential for the distilling premium maybe to recover from what was quite low last year. That's really just down to how our crop's actually going to perform, and that's maybe the big question.
Yeah, perfect. Well, we'll maybe just on that, how our crop's going to perform, we'll maybe just bring Danny and Alison seem to be back there, so we'll let you guys do your intro there and a little update from the farm as well, just to how barley's looking in Fife's finest town there.
In the kingdom. Sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened with the technology. I mean, from our perspective, I guess the reason that you've asked us on is to talk about our journey from farming to malting, and the reason that you've got two of us instead of one is because everything that we've done has been very much a team effort and a blend of skills, and my experience has been mostly off farm, I would say, and for 10 years or so working with a variety of different stakeholder organisations and businesses across the food and drink supply chain. And when I left to come home and become a partner in the farming business, the intention was to use that insight, knowledge and network to add value to what we were doing at home. And I guess the conversation that you've just been having highlights a lot of the reason that we chose to take the risk or take the next step into the supply chain, because from our perspective, we were tired, like everybody is, of being in that commodity marketplace and saw little in the way of added value in the cereals sector. But yet this emerging small-scale brewing and distilling industry, this provenance around whiskey and beer, and looking at what was happening in America and other places, and I guess fundamentally thought our cereals are worth more. And there's answers and there's questions and there's challenges that we're not taking because we're in this very traditional mindset that our crops are commodities. And that is the way it is. And our malting journey so far suggests that there is room for manoeuvre within that. But I'll let Dan tell you about, say,
spring barley,
how the crops are looking.
Yeah, evening all. I think since we started sowing back there in kind of early April, things were looking good and the conditions dried up nicely after such a horrendous back end, as we all know about. And we managed to get the crops in exceptionally good condition. And then, of course, we were subjected to this really dry spell of weather, very much similar to 2018. And I think, the crops now, after this rain that we've had, 40 odd mil, I think, or possibly more since, the weather broke, crops have actually evened up in the spring barley front. They were very uneven, especially on the heavy ground. And we're beginning to think that, come harvest time, it's going to be really uneven ripening. And I think, time will tell when it comes round to harvest, but, looking from afar, things look a lot more even, throughout the whole cropping. And that's spring barley, wheat, oats, the whole lot. I would say it almost looks like it could be potentially 10 days ahead of, a normal harvest period, which is a bit concerning because I'm not quite ready for that yet. But, things are, I'm not saying the rain came at the right time, because I don't think it maybe did, but it wasn't far away, I think, so I can rest easy at night now. Although saying that, when it comes to malting, my nighttime regime has been disturbed as well during kilning. So, my work-life balance from the monitor farm that I was looking for hasn't existed yet, I'm afraid, but been interesting times.
Absolutely. So how do you think we're getting on now in terms of stocks of barley internally with the distilleries being closed? Do you think there is going to be this glut at harvest time, or are we going to be facing that? I mean, that's really to everybody, or do you think we are going to see, it'll be all right on the night type effect?
I think there's, what do I know really apart from, I think there is going to be a bit of a glut. I think there's going to be a carryover. I don't think this COVID-19 has helped. I think obviously there's been a slow up in production on that front. I think, the Scottish malting side of it has been ticking away quite nicely, but I think they will have a carryover going into this coming harvest time, which is a wee bit concerning. Although what carryover they will be taking through, we'll find out what the kind of nitrogen levels are like for coming up to this harvest, which will be quite interesting. Obviously, they'll be carrying over kind of nitrogens, and we'll see how this year's harvest performs.
Julian, have you comments from the domestic stocks?
Well, there's no concrete figures on what sort of effect so far COVID's had. I mean, I'm aware some of the co-ops and others have taken steps to take on some more storage. So, some of the stores aren't quite as empty as they probably should have been, given some of the distilleries slowed up or stopped for some time. But I haven't seen. I mean, whiskey seems to be less affected to some extent than brewing, and it is a long-term business. It's as long as a lot of it's been more about physical distancing and things in some of the smaller distilleries. Whether there's a more longer term impact of global economy slowing on the sales, I don't know. But the potential is there that the whiskey industry may continue relatively. Any indication I've had is that they will try. There's no great necessarily shutdown on the cards anywhere. But there's just so much uncertainty out there. It's hard to be too definitive. But every indication I've had from people I've spoken to is that we'll be taking in, the intakes will be there. I mean, one thing to bear in mind is that we import a lot of malt from England, well, mainly from England, and potentially we may just malt our own barley and bring in a bit less from further south. That would might be one obvious thing if we don't need quite so much barley this year.
Yeah, and then if we take that further on, David, I mean, where do we see import levels? Sort of question I'm stealing from Gordon Rennie earlier in the week, but import levels of maize. If we're going to have a surplus of barley in here, we can't possibly surely need the glut of maize coming in this harvest that we saw last year. I mean, where are we sitting with that? How much maize comes in for alcohol production? Do you know, and how much for feed? And are we going to see that this year?
So it's kind of difficult to split it out into what is specifically going into what home, because obviously when people are buying maize, you're importing 60,000 ton vessels, and then it's sort of being split up into smaller parcels to go elsewhere. But as things have stood in recent weeks, maize prices for import September onwards are competitive from the Black Sea, and it just boils down to a numbers game eventually, doesn't it? That if it is significantly cheaper and it stays significantly cheaper, we will see a large volume of maize imported. On a UK level, if we're talking of a UK wheat crop, that's going to be in the sort of 10 million ton mark. We are going to need to import a significant amount of feed grains to offset that deficit, and maize is going to be the most competitive at the moment. That means that our domestic feed barley has to stay competitive against it, even with a slightly pessimistic view on yields, predominantly for England more than Scotland. We're going to have an exportable surplus of barley, and as Julian was just saying then, with the uncertainty over the malting demand, that's only going to increase the proportion of feed that we're going to have to export. That's got to go to third countries. It's got to compete with maize. And so, that underlying feed barley price has some significant risks to it. And I would be thinking, when we've seen smaller wheat crops before, we've been importing close to 3 million tonnes of maize, and I would expect us to be doing that for the next marketing year.
Yeah, so Gordon, I see you've just joined there. We're actually debating your question just now about how much maize we're going to import this year. But so you still think, even with having a surplus of barley, that we will still bring in this huge amount of maize into the country, which can be either for alcohol production or feed?
Yeah, sure. I think predominantly it's probably the feed side of things where it comes to it, because of the better nutritional value and how it can be used in feeds. You've got to be blending your feed for the animal that they're going to be sending it to, and maize has a higher energy level and higher nutritional levels, and is in some ways easier to use than larger and larger volumes of barley in feed rations. So I think there's kind of a structural element as to how much feed barley, the UK can consume anyway, because of structurally how it can be blended into rations. And it isn't just a direct one-to-one relationship between losing wheat and putting barley in its place, because of the different nutritional values. So maize is currently more competitive into that ration.
So how is the maize? Oh, carry on, Julian. Sorry.
I was just going to say, so in Scotland, we've got potentially, although it's not necessarily always used, but we've got nearly 1 million tonnes of distilling capacity for grain, but of which about 300,000 is geared up for maize and the rest is wheat. But we've not been operating near that level for a few years. And the other thing about imported maize, a lot of it's really French maize that's coming in for distilling, because of the assurances that they can give about being non-GM. So whereas the feed market is obviously willing to take other origins, and there's about a £10 differential, so that the French maize at the moment is about £10 over, as you say, the Black Sea maize. So that is one difference between the sort of general market and the distilling market.
So, and how do we shouldn't really get into tariffs this quickly, but the tariffs between the two. So we're bringing in French maize. Is that more attractive than bringing in US?
On a global scale, yes. US maize, because of the current tariff systems that we have, and also the restrictions from bringing in GMO product, means that it's not really competitive. In a purely hypothetical sense, if we were allowed to bring in GM crops and there were no tariffs, then yeah, US maize would be highly competitive. And I think a couple of years ago, in 2018, when we had the large drought, in that year when we were coming out of harvest, US maize was about $40 to $50 per tonne cheaper than domestic grains. And if we didn't have any tariffs and we were allowed to bring in GM product, then yeah, it would come in. I think, as Julian was saying, French is a key origin. We also bring in a little bit of Canadian, but really it's going to be Eastern European and Black Sea feed grains that are going to be the sort of lowest common denominator that we have to compete with.
And Black Sea, generally, I think I was on one of the ODA calls earlier in the month, and I think Black Sea actually looking quite good, isn't it, this year? So what's the predictions for harvest from Eastern Europe?
Yeah, everything is looking good. Ukraine maybe slightly down on where it was a year ago, but I think the key thing from a Black Sea point of view is it's more the Russian wheat crop. You're looking at another 80 million tonne Russian wheat crop. There's some question marks if there's a bit of dry weather that's creeping into the forecast that could affect some of their spring crops. And that will play out over the next month. Same for US maize, if I'm honest. There's some dry weather and some hot temperatures in most of the US through to the middle of the month, and that always spooks Chicago investment traders when they walk to work in the morning and it's 100 degrees Fahrenheit outside, and they think, should I be short of this market? And they get a little bit twitchy. But in general, I think EU and Black Sea is probably slightly lower year on year. From a barley point of view, again, thinking about exporting, the key thing really is the change to the Australian crop, that they're getting a bigger crop this year, and that global trade will be affected by that.
Wow. Yeah. So in terms of longevity of price, you think that we are in a little bubble just now going to harvest, and actually after harvest, you probably see that sliding away a little bit once the short's fulfilled. Do you think, or?
Yeah, as things stand now, I think there's still enough to keep people very sort of on edge, because there's still a bit of uncertain weather out there, and we've seen a big jump up in Chicago maize prices over the last week or so, because the US cut 2 million hectares off their maize acreage. I think we're still expecting a big US maize crop. In general, I don't think there's any sort of severe weather issues around the world that's actually creating any major supply side problems. There's probably a lot of hope and emphasis being placed on southern hemisphere crops. So your Argentine wheat crop, your Brazilian maize crop, sort of going into the winter, and then the Australian crops as well. So that's a change around from what we've seen for the last 2 or 3 years, obviously with the drought in Australia that hurt their crops over there. But from a UK point of view, like we were saying, we're going to need to import parity, and weak sterling will keep us insulated to an extent.
Yeah, fantastic. Perfect. Okay, now just to progress this on, guys, so just a little reminder, you'll see the little hand in front of you on your screen. If you do want to ask a question, just pop your hand up and we'll come down to you. Obviously, I'm getting all my information out here pretty quick on. So, Julie, we've got quite a few texted questions and from the Farming Forum. Do you want to ask a few of them?
Yep, sure. So some of these questions came from our business group members who prepared the promotional videos that have been streaming throughout the week. First question, some of these points will have already been covered slightly with some of the questions, but first question's from Donald Ross. In 2009-2010, after the credit crunch, we saw a slowdown in whisky sales, which reduced the barley demand. What effect will this larger shock have on our 2021 harvest? We go ladies first to go to Alison.
Me? I think possibly the whisky industry is a little more diverse than it was there then. You've got a lot of small scale distilleries popping up with big brand presence. And with those brands comes a much greater need to address that whole provenance question. So, okay, they're small in terms of the capacity that they've got, but I do think there's a different environment in that industry now than there was then, and more questions being asked around, because I see in the chat there's a question about how vulnerable is the Scottish whisky brand, given the continued use of imported raw materials. And I think there is a vulnerability there now. And, with the work that we're doing through Crafty Maltsters, we're trying to demonstrate the value that you can get over and above just buying Scottish, but the work that we're looking at in how you can impact flavour. And I think everything that we do to address that vulnerability should be in a really about the opportunity and in a positive way, rather than a defensive, why aren't you buying our malt? Because there's a lot of opportunity that we can offer to a lot of whisky brands.
I mean, the growth obviously in the whisky exports has been in the malt whisky, and that's been a phenomenal success. So, and that obviously gives us a lot more, because when you actually look at distilling barley, it really is Scotland plus a little bit in England. It's actually very hard to get distilling barley anywhere else. So as that grows, that is good for Scotland. The grain distilling, which is obviously going into some of the blends, that's the one that has sort of stagnated, as it were. And I mean, there's a lot of question about whether we could obviously try and make sure that's Scottish grain, but that's harder to deal with, because you need a premium to separate malting barley out. You need a premium, and you need a similar thing in grain, and it's harder for the industry to kind of come up with a workable premium for, say, Scottish wheat, which it would need. I think some of the varieties are actually key, and the processability of the varieties, and we've got a few candidates now that are looking a lot better, and that is so key to us. If we can get varieties that deliver what the distilleries need, then they shouldn't really be looking abroad for maize as well. So whether there's a provenance on the grain whiskey can be achieved, that's we have looked at that a wee bit. It's not as easy as with the malt whiskey. It's easier to identify with malt whiskey of Scotland.
Perfect. Claire, have you sort of see your hands up? Do you want to pop in there?
Yeah, I suppose it's a bit of a follow-on from the earlier session about net zero, and they talked about heritage varieties. I suppose more to Danny and Alison, how does that fit with your kind of company brand, and is that something you look at? And then maybe to the wider group, how does that then fit into a commodity product, and is there an opportunity within that, or are we limited to where we go forward as growers and what we grow in the ground?
Sustainability is a huge driver for us, and I think what has enabled us to look at it more closely is the fact that we've added value to our product. If you're in a I'm echoing. If you're in a commodity, you're just driven by yield, whereas we're obviously adding value to the product, and that allows us to look more closely at what we're doing in terms of soil health. And I don't know if Dan's got a view on.
Is that working okay now, or is it still echoing?
No, you're fine. It's just a second till I find the person that's not on mute. So carry on.
Right, okay. Yeah, as Alison said, it's all about the sustainability, and that's not just the crop that we're growing, because I think first and foremost, without the farm and the soil, there will be no malting. So we really need to take a good close look at the soil and how we can be more sustainable in growing, whether it's a conventional or a heritage crop. And we've been doing over the last 2 or 3 years, not that it's new to the market, but for us it is, we've been trying to do a bit of direct drilling with winter cereals in the heavier ground, and I think we'll probably try and adapt a wee bit more of that and try and traditionally farm to some degree with incorporating a bit more straw, trying to encourage a bit more biodiversity back into the soil, which I think is a terroir kind of aspect of it, going down that direction.
I think the only other thing I would say is we need a much more collegiate relationship with the rest of the supply chain on that, because the whisky or distilling and brewing industry is receiving pressure about their sustainability agenda, and from a whisky industry point of view, it's a really hard one. And I think there's room for a discussion about how we look at the carbon footprint across that whole supply chain, and working much more closely together, not just to allow the distillers to sell the story of how we conserve or look after the land, but how we work together to actually improve the sustainability across the chain and redistribute the value across the chain.
Perfect. Now, I think we've a little question in there from Elaine Booth that will follow on quite nicely as well. Julie, do we?
Yes, we do. Follows onto the carbon footprinting and a bit of a natural capital. So Elaine is very much aware that carbon footprinting is going to become more important as we move forward. But what do you think the challenges are for those kind of smaller types of businesses in the area? And perhaps more importantly, what do you think the opportunities are?
And I think we'll add on to that obviously there is going to be a trade of green bonds and carbon auditing, which we did touch on in the last section, which is obviously another trade to follow on. But what do you guys think towards that, Alison? If we come to you first, Alison and Danny.
I think it goes back to what I said earlier, that when you're in a commodity marketplace, you're driven by yield, and there's little room for you to look beyond that. So it needs to be a whole supply chain approach to that carbon footprint. And I think often we feel like the responsibility is heaped to us as the grower, to address all of those issues. And perhaps if we, took that whole supply chain approach, there's, just a sharing of responsibility. So I think there's opportunity, but I think that opportunity has to come with added value.
Absolutely. Julian, have you comments on that?
I think, we're very early days as to understand how the consumer has responded to the last 3 months. People have been looking much harder at where their food's coming from. Obviously, is there stuff on the shelves? That's number one. And what kind of food are they having? And COVID's made everyone realize that we can't just lock yourself up and do what you want. Your impact affects everyone across the world. And, if your actions can be positive, then so I think consumer interest in sustainability seems to be on the up. The only obvious problem we've got is people's incomes and things are going to be affected by the COVID. But the desire, I think, is probably going up from what, this huge event is struck through to the consumer, hasn't it? And it's, hopefully we can benefit from that. But it's hard to say, like any of these things with the COVID, there could be some good things, but there may be problems coming out as well.
Yeah, an interesting one. We did see there was a few messages out today about just having a little look forward, David, especially to 2022 and just what's going to happen in there, just to, try and ride the wave a little bit more evenly. What's your thoughts there, both in the previous question and how to look forward in there?
It's a tricky one, isn't it? Because I think, from my personal view of sort of agriculture, sometimes, we can be slightly guilty of forgetting that there's 99.5% of the population don't really understand farming or agriculture, and even if they would like to, have a good idea, if you spend a lot of time, looking at consumers and how they operate, it's still predominantly driven by price. And I'd admit to it, I'm a guilty consumer. I go to the supermarket and I will buy something and I will be driven by the price, and I'll only realize what I've done when I've got back home and I'm putting it in the fridge and I realize that pork that I'm putting in the fridge is Danish, but my instant reaction is driven by the price. And I think, as Julian was saying, the sort of recessionary effect that we're going to see and that longer term negative recessionary impact of coronavirus is going to have an impact on how consumers view things. And it's a challenge that we face as an industry, across a whole different load of levels. When we're talking about, say, heritage varieties, as we were talking about a minute ago, there are great added value aspect that we can bring into a business, but they can't be spread wholesale because there isn't the demand for them and there isn't the market for them. So it's about, understanding what that longer term demand picture is and making sure that we're able to match our supply to meet that demand, but doing that in all of the ways that we've just been talking around reducing carbon footprint. And I think as Alison mentioned a moment ago, the emphasis, I think, will continue to be upon the farmer to take the lead on that, and it will be driven by the supermarket's requirements, and it will be passed down the supply chain, and ultimately that emphasis will come back to the farmer over the next few years. And it comes back to all of the conversations that have been had over the last couple of years around public money for public goods and what it means, and all those kind of ambiguous conversations. Ultimately, what we're talking about is a consumer base that is driven by popular trends. And as we saw with organics 10, 12 years ago, the financial crash of 2008 had a massive impact on the demand for organics because people moved to more affordable foods. And we're yet to see how the changing consumer perception of food will be played out because of the economic impacts of coronavirus. And if we have anywhere, well, we're probably going to get a larger economic impact from coronavirus than what we did the 2008 financial crash. So it's going to mean a very difficult time to be able to actually fully understand what the consumer wants, because I'd still believe they'll be highly driven by price. And as Julian was saying, in a world where people, thousands of people are losing jobs, price will always be the main driver for their first reaction.
So how vulnerable, sorry, there's a question from David Fuller-Shapcott as well. So how vulnerable in general would you think brands are now? And especially we've got the Scottish whisky brand there, which is obviously quite topical. We've got Scotch beef as well, but these are commodities, and like you say, people are actually starting to wonder about what's actually going into them and how sustainable it is in terms of the growth in the supply chain with it. So how vulnerable do you actually think these brands are? And then, where do we go after that? I mean, Scotch whisky is obviously massive to us, isn't it?
Can I just...
Yep.
Yeah. I think in the cereals sector, we've missed out a whole chunk there in terms of education, because from what's particularly since our experience with crafty maltsters, very few people understand the ingredient base of the alcohol that they drink. And it's incredible, even people that are knowledgeable in the industry will come to see us and say, where's the beer? Where's the liquid? And have absolutely no idea what malt looks like. And I think as an industry, we're heavily reliant on other organisations to do much of our business function in terms of research and development, marketing and sales. And because as individual businesses, we can't possibly change the consumer mindset. The responsibility to do that falls to the organisations that represent us in all these different areas. And there is a massive education piece to do on the cereals side, and whether that's in whisky or whether that's in porridge oats or whatever it might be. But there are countless opportunities out there that we're not taking advantage of because people don't have the full picture.
There's one thing, that I've had it put to me by people in the industry that actually the supermarkets with the internet, it can actually, this direct marketing is an incredible opportunity for agriculture, and the COVID things, because everyone's locked up, they've actually tapped into it, haven't they? There's nothing, everyone can order anything they want from anywhere in the world, and it's there the next day and from a van. You don't need to go into a supermarket. And so that's an incredible opportunity to connect directly with what are we doing on our farm with, here's our products, do you want some? There's no middleman in the way, that must be an opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen it with home brewing. We didn't sell to home brewers prior to lockdown, and obviously there was a massive surge in demand of people brewing at home. So it was a market that we've gone into, that we're able to direct sell to, that we hadn't previously considered. So yeah, I see that as a huge opportunity in different sectors.
Perfect. Okay, we've got another question there from Jamie Leslie as well. Julie, have you got that to hand?
Yes, so on the recommended lists and varieties, this is currently quite centred around yield being one of the main selection criteria. In the future, do you think there'll be room for varieties to have more features on marketing ability? Perhaps on the marketing it could be taste and flavour, or in terms of agronomy, it may be early maturity, disease resistance, or the ability to cope with lower inputs. What are your thoughts? And we can go to Julian first. Quite a mouthful there.
I think, I think, as you say, the focus on yield has been very single-minded over decades, which has had various effects on the crops, not always necessarily the best. And, it is the margin, isn't it, at the end of the day? And whether you get 5 tons or 10 tons a hectare is irrelevant. It's whether you make a reasonable margin. So I think there is a huge scope, and we've seen that with some of the varieties, people making headway with some of the heritage varieties, but it's obviously its investment in varieties is quite large, so you need a big market, and I think that is maybe the challenge, isn't it? Breeding cereals for sort of niche markets is probably a difficult one to finance, but I can see the benefits for the industry to have those.
Absolutely, it almost changes you from this commodity market, though, doesn't it? If you can pick a variety and actually get the intended market, which could be local. So if you're growing a specific barley, for instance, for a flavour for Danny and Alison, that takes you out of the commodity market. I know it's going to be priced against that, but it then does start to pull you more into a niche, doesn't it? If you can pick on certain traits, whereas just now it's barley.
Yeah, I mean, I think from our point of view, we went into malting to add value, but we also went into it to ask questions. And it took us 5 years to get where we are now. And a lot of that was about doing the proper market research behind the market that we were going into. And there's an incredible amount of research in America around flavour traits in different barley varieties. And I said earlier, there's unanswered questions out there, and the experience that we have, which obviously is limited since we only started in October, the variety and the malt processing and all of these things absolutely impact on the flavour. And if we're producing or growing an ingredient for a premium marketplace, then surely that flavour should be coming into that. So I think there's research and development, and we're already doing that with the Hutton and others. There's only opportunity in that, and I see huge opportunity. Shouldn't just be about yield.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, if you take that on, I mean, would a more positive attitude from the farming community to farm assurance be a benefit to a business like yours? If we had a different step that, for instance, say, you're growing a variety for its flavour instead of its yield, would that be of benefit to you with trade assurance in mind? Do you think there's a benefit to that?
I'd never really considered it from a farming perspective. I mean, we're looking at it from a certified malt point of view, and I don't know. There's an intangible thing in there as well, though, around you're growing flavour for more than just the ability to give it a set parameters. It's more than that. It's about the story behind it and how that adds value to a premium brand. It's about the differentiation and the fact that flavour is not necessarily always going to be consistent, but it will be special and it'll add something different to a particular brand. I think our mindset is so driven around being fixed in this box, whether that be the recommended list box or the commodity box or whatever it might be, that we've forgotten how valuable we are to the rest of the supply chain. And it's really, really time that we stood up a bit stronger and said, we've got a lot to offer here.
I absolutely agree. And I think that will become apparent over time. We do have nutritional meters and so much technology on the way that may just change the way that we are paid for what we produce. If people's diets require certain foods, then actually we can produce that to these people. Then that is absolutely good for their health. Now, what we'll maybe do just in a minute, just before we finish up, is a little quick quiz round the room. So I see Ian Green's on there from the north. So Ian, we'll maybe ask you a couple of questions in a minute, and James Hopkinson in the middle as well. So guys, this is really your chance. If you want to ask a question about grain markets at harvest, if you want to pop your hand up and come on into that, that would be perfect. And then Ian, it would be good to hear from you. You're a big spring barley grower up in the north, so that would be great to speak to you in a second. Claire, I see your hands up there.
Yeah, so it's just a bit of a follow-on from that farm assurance issue. I was listening to a podcast about bad behaviour in the supply chain, and that was often about auditing downwards from kind of supermarket through the processor back to the farmer. And I was just wondering, they were talking a lot about signals, and perhaps from a primary producer point of view, maybe we should be looking at signals that we should be auditing up and checking that we have integrity in Scottish produce, and us challenging the whole supply chain back up rather than it always being down and looking at negative signals, and it should be positive signals that we should be pushing back. I suppose I wish Andrew could join in this, because I think he's probably got quite nice answers to it as well.
Well, Andrew, take yourself off mute. You're more than welcome to chip in. If he's there. Nope, not going to get an Andrew. Nope, Must be having his supper. Right. Have we any viewpoints on that at all?
I think a lot of these iterate the same thing, and the industry. I mean, Alison and her family have taken steps to kind of invest in developing markets and things like that. You know, as you say, it's taking control and investing more in promoting yourself, developing your own industry, and how can the farming industry work a bit more together to do that? Because it is small businesses against whole much bigger companies further up. So that's the thorny question, is just is finding a way for everyone to pull together.
Yeah, I think though there's an authenticity to the messages that we deliver, and what we found was at the very beginning we were told, look, this is never going to be viable. You're never going to be able to compete with the large maltsters. You may as well just forget about it. But our view was, we're not trying to compete. We're trying to offer something completely different in a product that will suit some distillers and brewers and not others.
The craft industry is growing hugely. That's the thing, and that's where we want to be, in that craft market. And it's a unique product, not just because of the heritage that we're growing, but it's actually unique because it's just grown from one farm, and that's been translated through the malting, that the nitrogens are consistent, albeit consistent nitrogens, because it's all coming from 2 or 3 fields, or at least from the same farm anyway. And we'll process it slightly different when we dress the grain. We do dress it slightly harder, so we'll take out more, which in turn will feed back to the cattle anyway, so there's nothing wasted. So when it goes into the steeping process, we've got a bigger, bolder sample than potentially normally for the bigger guys, but we've got the luxury that we can feed back to the cattle what we dress out. And when we steep it, generally all the grains, because the nitrogens or the proteins, whatever way you look at it, all generally react all about the same time. And then when it goes into the germination process, it reacts at the same time. So when we get it out the other end, it is consistent. I like to think it's consistent, but the difference is it's giving it a unique flavour because of where it's coming from. And that's from one farm. And that's where the flavours, I think, are slightly different. And our process is that, I suppose, we've got the luxury that we are not under a strict regime of we need to get this malt all done within a 7-day period. If we feel the grain is not modified enough, then we'll give it another 10 hours or even 24 hours to make sure it's properly modified, and in turn it will have good friability, and it will in turn have good extract. And I think just taking it naturally rather than pushing it has made quite a significant difference in the end product on flavour wise.
Absolutely good. Listen, we'll just try and see that this may or may not work, but it'd be quite interesting just to hear quickly around the country. Ian Green, are you there? Can you speak? How's things looking up your end? How are you with grain marketing?
Locally, it's fairly been quite dry here. We've only received 22, 23 mil just in the last 3 weeks. So we've been very dry. Spring barley was really starting to suffer. It's recovered. I think it'll be okay, but it's going to be short of straw. A big concern is there's a lot of stores still pretty full of last year's barley. It's got a big carryover locally.
And how's that affecting you up there? I mean, have you got much forward sold, or what's your thoughts come harvest? I mean, obviously you can feed quite a substantial amount, but is there any way of mitigating that at all?
Well, forward sold probably as much as we'd want to be. We're probably sitting 50 to 60% sold. Sold a bit for next harvest. Probably didn't sell enough for next harvest in hindsight, possibly, but sold probably, I think it's about 15%, 10-15% for next harvest.
Good. Just shows you.
It was just one day I was dead lucky. It peaked, and it was 155 plus a £20 premium. Could be right or could be wrong, but it's a good starting place.
It's something in the book, isn't it? And it's well above the cost of production as well. So it
was just, I'm concerned, all the distilleries that are normally on 7 days, the majority of them are back to 5. Not them all, but the majority are back to 5. Some of them's been stopped for a wee while with the COVID, which was really not necessary because there was no contact within the buildings. But I don't know, it seemed to be some of the local MSPs seem to have a bit of grievance that they shouldn't be carrying on. So I think within trade locally, the talk is that some of the warehouses are getting quite full. So I would just be a little bit sceptical about next year.
Yeah. Interesting. I see just on the list there, Julian South's on the line as well from MAGB. Julian, have you any comments on what you're hearing here? What's your thoughts on the market?
Can you hear me?
Yes, thanks.
Yeah. I mean, it's pretty much in line with what you're saying, and I think the comment regarding the warehouses getting full, we've heard as well. I think there's a lot of stock in warehouses, and I think the global market. I'm sure I saw a figure somewhere of something like 17% reduction. But remember as well, things like airport shops. These are places where a lot of whiskey is sold, and most of them are pretty quiet at the moment.
Interesting. Sam, I see you're on from Graindex. How's Graindex getting on? What's your thoughts on the market? Are you able to comment, or are you there as well just before we head off?
Yeah, absolutely. It's can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. No, really interesting discussion tonight. Very useful, and fascinating about the malting barley. And Danny and Alison, your business is a real. I think puts a marker in the ground for other Scottish, spring barley producers or malt barley producers. So it's fascinating. But yeah, market-wise, I think we've seen a higher percentage of people selling forward for the new crop position. So 2021 harvest, and I mean, listening to Dave and Julian earlier, it's it has to be a decision on every individual business on cash flow and cost of production, and there's been hopefully some decent profit margins available with the prices and on the future screen. So yeah, new crop is probably a decent sell as well, and if we see a bit of an uptick and those prices further forward, then it's definitely worth looking at from our point of view.
Good. I see Mr. David Bell there as well, our yen winner from last year with the top barley yield. Dave, how's your yen crop looking this year? Whereabout are you with grain marketing? If you're listening or able to speak.
Evening all. Not looking as good as last year. In late, most challenging winter, as we all know, and a challenging spring. But it's still green or red actually. It's a new variety, Bordeaux, so it's got a nice red tape to it. But yeah, and marketing wise, again, my wheat yield is going to be back. So as we mentioned earlier this evening, don't want to sell any more until I know what's going to be in the shed, because it's too risky to be short.
It's such a tricky one, isn't it, against the TBA? As Julian was saying earlier, if there's some mechanism on fixing it against feed barley, or even taking a feed barley on the rest. But and is your plan still to deliver at harvest, or are you going to store on, do you think?
Delivering at harvest, don't have much space for storage, so that's why it's important for me to market forward, and so I can be assured of uplift, but also assured of or relatively speaking, of a good price that's above my production price.
Yep.
And with thanks to Farm Bench, that's how I managed to find my cost of production.
Oh, nice plug in there for Doreen and Julie and the team there. Eh? Love it.
Thanks,
all the hard
David.
work. Gold star. There you go. Right, okay, we'll whiz round the panel just for a final summary, and then we'll let you guys go. I'm sure the whiskey or the gin's waiting for everybody here. It's been long enough on grain market and such an uncertain market. So if we come back, David, do you want to sum up the thoughts from AHTB and a piece of advice for us on market, and what are we going to do?
I think it's probably repeating what I said earlier on, and probably following on what Sam said. Really, I think for a long time everyone gets too focused on marketing as a single crop year and just thinking everything's bound down to one decision. But realistically, with the type of decisions that modern arable businesses are making, we've got to be thinking longer term, and we've got to be thinking, what does it mean for our 3-year strategy, and how do you build your marketing around that? Getting too focused on the short term and getting too worried about what to do on the next day, you're probably going to tie yourself up in knots. I think having a longer term strategy, knowing your business, knowing your cash flow and your cost of production, and then setting a strategy around that is the key way to go, because the world is never going to get an easier place. So having a way to navigate through all these difficulties and a budget and a way to sort of plan, that's still a key tenet that every arable business should be following.
Yeah, so to turn around and say I want £200 a tonne for my wheat crop, is the days of that long gone? Is that just a dream now?
In certain circumstances, then yeah, of course, at some point in the future, wheat prices will go crazy again, and we will see that kind of thing. There will be a weather event. It will be horrible. There'll be forest fires in Russia again, and all that kind of thing, and we will see that kind of market. But you've got to plan to manage the troughs as well as the peaks, and just you've got to be aware of your own sort of personal risk as well, the amount of risk you're willing to take on, and then start to build your business planning around that. It's going to remain a volatile time. It's an opportunity as well as a risk.
Yep, perfect. Julian, how's your final remarks?
I think, I applaud the efforts of Alison and others who are looking for that premium, and I think that more effort needs to go into that in the long run. It's, if you think what difference, even £1 a tonne, if every malting barley sold in Scotland was put into some sort of development fund, to whether it's new varieties, new support the market, who knows what you could. It's amazing what you could probably do with that. Or whether it's left to individuals to chart their own progress, I don't know. But I think an investment in that future would really, to change the paradigm, change the sort of rules of where we are at the moment, I think is something to aspire to anyway. And how you do that, I'm not quite sure. But, as you say, but today we've just got to work with the cost that we need, and crop bench, again, is a good, you need to know your costs. So I think that's a good place to start for now.
Yeah, absolutely. Danny and Alison, what does the future hold for you guys? Another double capacity, is it?
Oh yeah, we're going to take over the world, aren't we? No, I like Julian's suggestion, because I think it's easy for people to be not dismissive, sorry, but look at what we've done and say, that's okay, that's fine for them, that's a niche market that they've created. But there's absolutely no reason why the principles of what we've done couldn't have been applied at a much larger scale, because it's about the brand, it's about the research and development, and exactly the points that Julian's made. And okay, it requires much more investment if you were going to have that kind of processing capacity. But we've got a moment now with everything that's happening with economic recovery, looking at where funding streams are going and the value that they create, whether that's in the rural or urban economy. And if we've got a proposition to put forward as an industry that adds value to the food and drink sector, now's the time to be putting it forward. So that would be my closing remark.
Said it all.
And Danny, get the combine ready. I don't know why you're still sitting here. Hurry up, come on. Perfect. Exactly. Perfect, guys. Listen, thanks very much for this evening. Thanks everyone for logging in. It's been a good session there. hope you've enjoyed Arable Scotland. We have one session left with Fiona Burnett at 8 o'clock, so please do click onto the Farming Forum. It's going to prove to be very interesting with live link to New Zealand in that one. So that's at 8 o'clock. It's through the Farming Forum. So if you go through that and click the link, it'll take you to go to webinar and you can punch the pin code in. Okay, thanks very much. And I think that's all from us. Okay,
Thank
good
you.
evening.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Take care.